Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 14. Welcome to the real world, kid. When Izuku decided he was going to do something, there was little anyone could say or do to stop him. As much as he got bullied, he never stopped analyzing heroes and refining his notebooks. No matter how many times he fell off the side of a building, he kept getting back up and trying the maneuver again. And no matter how many times people told him he couldn't be a hero, the harder he tried. No matter how many times the world told him he was unlovable, the more he tried to gain its affection. It was exactly that stubbornness that had Izuku dressed in his fully fitted suit, ready to go out looking for trouble. It's also what had him stopping in the back alley before he left to feed DJ her treats. He rounded the corner to hear the customary bang that announced DJ's arrival atop the dumpster. "Hey, DJ, I finally got you some new treats," he said, holding out a couple in an open hand. She'd been letting him get close more often since that day on the roof. Maybe he proved to her that he wouldn't cross a boundary she set, or maybe it was a coincidence and she was just finally warming up to him. Izuku had spent the last few weeks just coming out here and talking to her, and she never left even when he didn't have food to offer. Maybe she was just making sure he wasn't messing with her hunting grounds. Or maybe she was lonely too. Cats weren't necessarily pack animals, but everyone could use a friend, right? She stood up and walked over to sniff his hand and inspect the new treats. Apparently, they were to her liking, because she gently took them straight from Izuku's hand before stalking back to the other side of the dumpster. Success! He only gotten her to eat out of his hand once before, and he was worried that the long stretch between treats was going to put her off. Izuku was very happy it didn't. Her little face was so soft, and her whiskers were so long and tickly. What a perfect creature. It was nice to start the night off with DJ's seal of approval. Izuku had made himself a code of conduct. He wasn't going to try and apprehend everyone committing a crime. Not all crimes were bad anyway. Izuku also wasn't stupid enough to try to split up gang fights or drug deals. No, he knew his limits and wasn't trying to be on the wrong side of a gun again. He was just going to keep an eye out and help people if they were in immediate danger, like Shimamoto-san or that lady from his first incident. He wasn't going to drop down into groups, only isolated incidents. Turns out, Izuku had been lucky to run into all of his prior encounters. He had been out for hours, and not much had happened. He saw someone littering, but he didn't think that was something worth confronting them about, so he just threw the trash out himself. It's not like he had anything better to do. The first bars were set to close at 2 a.m., which was in about 45 minutes, and Izuku figured that forcibly ejecting drunk people from a bar and away from alcohol was probably a good recipe for people to make poor decisions. With that theory in mind, he made his way over to the closest one and waited. He didn't have to wait long. Before the bar even closed, two men were literally kicked out and were already screaming at each other. Izuku didn't even know what they were arguing about, because at this point the conversation had devolved into insults and death threats exclusively. He can see why they were kicked out. The argument quickly turned into a fist fight, but both men seemed to be too inebriated to land a solid hit. Maybe they'll just tire themselves out. Drunk adults and toddlers function similarly, right? Izuku was just gonna let them be. They were slowing down. He felt like a tired parent who had gotten to the point where they just let their kids screw around and find out. Unfortunately, one of the men pulled out a knife, and that was his cue. He didn't even bother being stealthy as he scaled his way down the wall. The unarmed man spotted him, but quickly directed his focus back to the other man, somehow just now realizing he had a knife, despite the man yelling several times that he had a knife and was going to stab him. Izuku doubted either man had heard a single word that the other had said since they were kicked out here. The unarmed man had started backing away in panic, so Izuku simply walked up to the other guy and kicked the hand that held the knife, letting it clatter to the ground. The two of them finally stopped shouting and just watched as Izuku picked up the knife and looked back at them. That was an interesting way to diffuse tension, replace anger with confusion. Izuku was really expecting one or both of them to turn on him, but they just kept looking at him, confused and slightly scared. Izuku was just confused. He shook his head and broke up the impromptu staring contest. If they weren't fighting, then this was no longer his problem. Both of you, just go home, Izuku said, finally breaking the silence. To Izuku's continued confusion, they listened. They both backed away from each other and started heading in opposite directions. That was anticlimactic. And he'd stolen another knife. But it's not like he could just give it back. That guy clearly wasn't responsible enough to have it. Whatever, into the collection it goes. Izuku continued his route around the city and mulled over that experience. Why did they just listen to him? Were they really that intimidated? They were both over a head taller than him, and all he did is kick that guy's hand and then pick up a knife and look at them. Isn't being drunk supposed to make you less scared or something? Wait, did they think he was a hero? The thought occurred to him mid-jump, and he almost fumbled the landing from laughing. They thought he was a hero? Oh, that's too funny. Tikaba Beach isn't the only part of this place that the city has let fall to the wayside. Izuku has never seen a hero in these streets, and the cops only came around if they were called. No, this place was lawless. That's the whole reason he was here. He couldn't get away with this in his old neighborhood. Some hero would have scooped him up on his first night out. Whatever. Izuku couldn't count on that ever happening again, so he couldn't let his guard down. He pressed on, more determined and less distracted by the odd encounter. It wasn't until just past 3 a.m. that he heard or saw anything of note. He was making his way back up onto a rooftop when he heard the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Oh no, that couldn't be good. Why did everyone have guns? Guns were illegal. Against his better judgment, Izuku followed the noise. The commotion was happening 2 streets over. There was a figure on the ground and another figure leaning over them, going through their pockets. Crap. Izuku ran full tilt toward the pair and was within kicking range before the offender could get their wits about them. They were fumbling with the gun, trying to point it at Izuku, but he planted a foot in the center of their chest and knocked them back with the force. They were sprawled on their back and disoriented, but they still had the gun in hand. Double crap. Izuku stepped forward and planted his foot on their wrist, pinning the gun arm to the ground. He was going to wrench the weapon out of their hand, but he couldn't leave his fingerprints all over it. That moment of hesitation was enough for his opponent to punch the back of his knee, sending him off balance and almost allowing them to free their hand. Triple crap. He really didn't want to break another person's hand, but he also really didn't want to get shot again. Making the necessary decision, Izuku quickly regained his balance, stepping off their wrist, pivoting and stomping on their hand with the other foot. The woman, judging by the horrible scream they let out, released the gun, and he kicked it away. While the woman pulled her injured hand to her chest, Izuku foolishly shifted his attention to the man on the ground. He wasn't moving. His attention was forced back to the woman when an unbearable burning sensation erupted from his ankle. Looking down, he saw the woman's hand glowing red and clutching his leg. Her hand had burned through parts of his pants and into his bare skin in a second. Luckily, her grip was no match for Izuku pulling back with his entire body weight, and he pried himself free before she could burn him any worse. Izuku strategically backed out of reach, placing himself between her and the gun. He needed to take her out, and it was much easier to use his signature KO while she was standing, so he had to let her come to him. Forget that. He wasn't going to risk getting burned again. The second she was upright, he charged. Grabbing his flashlight from his pocket, he brought it down at the junction of her neck and shoulder with all his might, and she dropped like a brick. Before she even settled into the concrete, Izuku dashed over to the man who lay unmoving in the alley. There was a sluggishly growing pool of blood surrounding his head. Oh, gosh. His face was... Kami. Izuku was going to be sick. He had to look away. That man was dead. There was nothing he could do for him. He was too late. His hands were shaking. He was too late. He was too late, and now a man was dead. Brutally dead. He must have been shot in the back of the head. His face... his face... How could she do that to someone? How could anyone do that to anyone? She couldn't. How could she? He was... No. He needed to think clearly. Cops. He had to call the cops. He could make emergency calls on his phone still, which was the only reason he didn't replace his phone with a watch, because telling the time was all it was good for after being cut off from service. He was going to do that, but he couldn't let the call be traced back to him. He could use her phone, but he couldn't get his fingerprints on it. He really needed to get gloves. Whatever. He needed to call the cops. He could wipe the phone down as best he could when he was done with it. He turned back to the woman lying on the ground, and his gut roiled. He didn't want to get any closer to her, but he couldn't let her get away with what she'd done. Steeling himself, he fished around her pockets and pulled out her phone and bypassed the security code by making an emergency call. As it rang, he cleared his throat and did his best to will his voice not to shake when the operator answered. He lowered his voice as much as he could. He reported the bare bones of what happened, leaving out his involvement entirely, gave them the location, and hung up. He secured the woman's hands behind her back with her own belt in case she woke up before the cops got there, and climbed his way up to the rooftop. He stayed there until he heard sirens in the distance, then headed straight home. That was enough for the night. When Izuku got back, he just sat and stared into the darkness of the stairwell for a while. His ankle burned, but he was used to burns. He could tune out the pain. He could tune out everything except the sight of that man's disfigured face. The stairwell was pitch black, but he could still see it clear as day. Izuku's not sure how long he sat there, but eventually he was able to flick on the lamp and inspect the burn on his ankle. It wasn't too bad. It would probably scar, but he was more upset about the pants. Luckily, they weren't synthetic fibers, so his skin wasn't melded to melted plastic. But there was ash in the wound, so he'd have to clean it out. He blotted it with alcohol and let the pain ground him. He held the rag there longer than was strictly necessary, which probably wasn't a healthy response, but he couldn't be bothered to care. He let his hands carry through the familiar steps of dressing a burn, while his mind drifted again. When there was nothing left to do, he flicked off the light and laid down but didn't close his eyes. He knew he should sleep. He had school tomorrow, but he didn't want to see what awaited him in his dreams.